It took me a minute, but we've got the full report on Morningstar, who quadrupled or 4x their price target for Palantir from $21 up to $79 per share. And they project massive numbers for Palantir's future, like well over $1 trillion in TAM later on in the report, justifying why they believe Palantir should be valued the way they are today. So let's dive right in, and it's a long one. So basically, they set the premise of comparing Palantir to Salesforce, which is a giant today worth over $300 billion in market cap, where they believe and see similarities of that company back in the 2010s to the Palantir that we see today. They essentially believe Palantir is in great positioning here, which we've talked about around how they help operationalize LLMs, and not really in the model making business themselves, but rather in making them useful for whoever wants to use them. And this is being recognized here where the true value is really coming from these LLMs, where they are supercharged with Palantir and using accurate data and context provided by the customers who are utilizing these models. But really, they believe it is still early for Palantir, and obviously there is always volatility that can happen when expectations are priced in and multiples are relied on for the narrative, but still believe that the current market valuation is justified. Now, they provide some more context on what Palantir is and does, which is a nice summary for those who are new, but there are numerous resources out there to get into the nitty gritty, especially by Palantir themselves. But really, they provide a way to aggregate and make data useful for companies on top of having a read-write loop where those who can view and have access across the organization can find value from this complete picture. And this is most importantly a system that is continuously building and improving upon itself and compounding the value it provides for any industry. Now, the big differentiator, which they point out, and I've always pointed out too, is actually their ontology. Essentially, not only having the data available here, but being able to map the relationships at scale and being able to truly tie together on what things really mean for real, and that you're able to get a real complete picture instead of just a bunch of data sources that might need to be managed in order to maintain those relationships. And this is across any business, government, or military at scale in the world that runs into this kind of problem, and Palantir seems to manage it. And Palantir's offerings too are shown here, and over time, we've eventually gotten to the recognized form that they are today with AIP. But really, this has come to fruition with their new process of AIP boot camps, which have been able to close the deals and showcase what they can do in people's hands. The true value in this is giving real touch points where customers and prospects can actually solve their pain points that are at the top of their minds here, and proving that the work is, the best way to convince them a client is instead of reading a PowerPoint on the theoreticals, is actually getting it done. Now, the total addressable market, too, is always an interesting point around Palantir because we see them across all industries first, and they even warn this is still their best guess. But regardless, they know once customers are on Palantir, the switching costs just make it that much more difficult to leave because they work and there isn't another close competitors with the same offerings or same level of offering. And they note here they're the only company with the ontology framework that makes datasets actually usable at scale. And I'll add in securely as well with LLMs. And really, their biggest competitors is internal IT departments who may see themselves become redundant or less useful when compared to Palantir and its capabilities. This has been pointed out by Karp himself too, that they are the biggest competitors when they go to the customers. And they go over how they're differentiated, but essentially they make data usable and workable in a scalable way and allow more advanced deployments possible because the data plumbing behind the scenes gets managed and gets them to that point with Palantir. And that's why these efficiency gains accumulated means that switching costs are high once you are on Palantir. So they recognize the fact that the stickiness lies in the usefulness and value, not just because they're stuck in a contract. These are real things that work, or at least not as well if they were to get off Palantir. And adding to the thesis on Palantir too, they know that net revenue retention continues to hover over 100%, meaning that their customers are not leaving them, but actually expanding their spending with Palantir. They believe this trend will continue on much larger, and for context, note how the average Palantir customer spends more than $1 million per quarter on the software, which is not cheap by any means if you've worked at any mid-sized company per se. Granted, there are some ginormous customers too for Palantir, probably skewing this, but still very big. And they point out too some of the great work and examples they've done, especially with healthcare, the military, and other huge non-monetary value that they can provide. And to add to their optimism too is that the bootcamp strategy has paid off in their opinion, facilitating growth and getting more prospective buyers experience with the software, which helps diversify their business also from relying on government revenue when they first went public, has been crucial. This has been greatly expanding and shows that they are in all kinds of markets with net revenue retention to back this up. So they see Palantir's TAM truly being massive, growing to around $1.4 trillion by 2033, so in around 8 years, but do see the inflection growth starting, in their opinion, from 2028 to 2030 at around 40% per year. Now, that is massive here when compounding this over multiple years, because you're essentially almost doubling that metric in 2 years if you're growing at 40% per year. But this has been seen before, as they mentioned with their Salesforce example back in the last decade. And note that's still their base case, where bull case wise, they may even see a $1.6 trillion TAM, where a 3% penetration rate for them for Palantir, which may be conservative actually, depending on what you think, put them at around $280 per share at that point. And not only at the top line opportunity, but also in the margins. They can see gross margins scaling super fast and projecting a 400 basis point improvement over the next 10 years. So not only bringing in more money, but also keeping more of it over time, which makes sense for software companies as long as they keep their expenses in check with the scale of their products over time. But remember, these are still their best guesses and a little bit of apprehensiveness here, depending on if cloud costs eat into the future margins. But regardless, he concludes that Palantir is benefiting on all fronts, top and bottom, and see positive trends for them into the future, and are now bullish on the stock, its growth, and profitability going forward. So interesting perspective here on the full report. Remember, every analyst has their own opinion, so you please have to do your own due diligence. None of this being investing advice, of course, but let me know your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next video.